Supposed to wait and clap at the end to see if it's any good. Can people in the back hear me okay? Okay, usually I'm pretty loud. Okay. So I did change the title from what I had initially put up, but hopefully this is a little more descriptive. So today I'm going to talk about data and modeling in some different ways and how we can use data and modeling to try and understand different aspects of climate variability and climate change and how it impacts certain systems we might care about. I'm going to talk first about some statistical learning theory examples. I'll explain what this is in a minute. One focused on climate and coccolithophores and one focused on Vibrios in the Chesapeake Bay. So kind of more of a microbiology sort of bent on that, but we'll talk about that in a minute. And then come and talk about the work that was mentioned earlier with stochastic simulation, looking particularly at the impacts of hurricanes on power systems and how this might change in a changing climate. And then have a few closing thoughts at the end. If you have questions, stop me and ask as we go, if you want to do that. Okay, so first talk a little bit about what statistical learning theory is. So this is a somewhat new term. It's really a framework for developing models for either prediction or gaining understanding, or both, based on data. So it's a different term for some other sorts of techniques. It really draws from statistics, data mining, and computational science. And there's really two general types of problems. Supervised learning, where we have a response variable that we're trying to model or predict. So for example, I might be trying to estimate the number of tropical cyclones occurring in the Atlantic Basin in a given year. And then I've got some covariates, x, which I observe or estimate, things like sea surface temperatures and AMO and NAO and INSO signals and things like that. Or we have unsupervised learning, where we don't have a response variable we're trying to predict. We're just trying to find patterns in the data. So for example, some people do this with various climate modes and try to identify new climate modes using some spatial clustering sorts of techniques. So we've got supervised learning and unsupervised learning. Today I'm not going to be talking about unsupervised learning. This is just to set the stage. We're going to be sticking here for the first part of the talk. All right, probably many of you are familiar with this, but the basic idea is we have an N by P matrix, X, of potential explanatory factors. We have to have some knowledge about the system so we can figure out what explanatory factors we might want to include. We don't just dump everything in the kitchen sink in there. We need some knowledge of the system to understand what's going on. We've got some response variable, y, and we train a model of some general form, y is equal to f of x. And what statistical learning theory does is lets us be flexible with that f and how we model that functional form. And we can train that based on a data set. We have to be careful. So for prediction, really what we're given is a new set of covariates x prime. So in our example of trying to predict the number of tropical cyclones in a coming year, we might be given estimates of INSO, sea surface temperature, in NAO, for example, in the Atlantic Basin or the main development region in 2016, and asked to give us an estimate of how many cyclones should I expect, or more likely, what's the probability distribution of that. On the other hand, we also have inference, which is more about what are the relationships, if any, between the various elements of x and y. That is, we're trying to understand the system. Sometimes we want to do both. Preferably, we want to be able to do both. Sometimes we care a lot about prediction. Sometimes we care more about inference. And we're often interested in approximating how much y in the margin changes as a function of one element of x. We might do this in an expected value sense. We might do it in some other sense, but some function of y and how that depends on x. Okay, so why might we want to do this? Well, we've got increasing amounts of data becoming available in the sorts of situations that I'm concerned about. So I work a lot on infrastructure, power infrastructure, water infrastructure, sewer, things like that. And we're getting an awful lot of data about how these systems respond to given events. We've got lots of sensing out there, but we also have a lot of remote sense data, satellite and aerial. For example, we have one project I'm not going to talk too much about today, but we're looking at urban heat island effects. And there is a tremendous amount of data that's now available where we can start to try and get at more local aspects of that. But we also have things like social media and citizen science projects, for example, like eBird. If you're concerned about bird species diversity and things like that, you've got all these citizen science projects that give you another source of data. They all have different spatial scales. There's different issues with noise and data quality. Obviously, a citizen science project is a lot different than a sensor. So you do have to be careful with that. But if used with care, statistical learning theory-based methods might provide us the ability to leverage this data to try and get maybe predictions, but to understand, project, and perhaps predict how climate variability and change may impact the sorts of systems that we're concerned about. So that's really what we're trying to look at with these statistical learning theory methods. Okay, so one important distinction. Fit versus prediction. So a model that fits well is not necessarily a model that predicts well. And this is a distinction that is not accounted for or is lost in the literature a surprising amount of time. So one of my other hats I wear is I'm a journal editor for 2 journals, and I am surprised at the number of papers I get where people present a linear model and say the R-squared is 0.98, so it's a good predictive model. No, that tells me it fit the data set well. That doesn't tell me that it's a good predictive model. When we think about prediction, we have the bias variance trade-off. This is kind of the classic thing we have to deal with when we're trying to develop a predictive model. So if you have a really quite simple model, like the simplest model would be an intercept-only linear regression model, your variance of your prediction is really low. There is none. You always predict the same value for everything. But your bias is incredibly high. And your total predictive area is a combination of bias and variance, and you want to be in this middle point where it's the lowest. The problem is we don't know that. So what we do is holdout validation. So you develop a model on a portion of the data set, predict the portion you held out. And you do this over and over and over again in different ways so you can get a sense of the predictive accuracy. We can do repeated random holdouts. We can do k-fold cross-validation. We can do temporally or spatially based repeated holdouts. And this gets tricky. How do you define a holdout when you've got a spatial process or a temporal process where you've got some correlation? And we can do hold one out if you've got a relatively small data set. So just keep this in mind throughout the talk as we go. Fit versus prediction. If you remember nothing else from the talk, remember this slide. And submit papers to me that talk about prediction and test it. Okay, so now we're going to come to the first kind of project I'm going to talk about. Coccolithophores in the North Atlantic. So this was a paper published in Science late last year. It was a joint project between a bunch of us. The lead author, Sarah Rivero-Cala, is a PhD student at Johns Hopkins in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department. Anand is in the Earth and Planetary Sciences Department, and Anand is her advisor. So Sarah took my class a few years ago. So this started as a class project. So it's always fun when a class project ends up someplace like science. But what did we actually do? So first, what is a coccolithophore? So coccolithophore is a eukaryotic phytoplankton. It occurs in lots of different places in the ocean. It has an interesting role when we think about carbon fluxes. And it captures CO2 and potentially exports it out to the deep ocean through rainout. It's a calcifier. So in theory, the rate of carbon accretion should depend on both CO2 and pH. And based on what we can find in the literature, there was currently contradictory and still somewhat contradictory evidence on the impacts of increasing CO2 on coccolithophore abundance, particularly in the North Atlantic, which is where we were looking. Well, what data do we have? Sarah started kind of asking questions about coccolithophores and asking, what do we know about them? Well, there's this thing called the continuous plankton recorder, and this is a picture of one of the new versions. It's been towed behind ships crossing the Atlantic for decades, and it's basically a target of opportunity. When there's a ship that'll tow it, they stick it on behind the ship and they tow it across, and then they deliver it. It spools silk at a known rate. You know the position through GPS, so then you can get the tracks. And they use it to study lots of different things. We used it to look at coccolithophores in particular. There's a challenge, though, in that the mesh size on the silk is bigger than the size of a coccolithophore. So you're not going to get exact concentration. So we started looking at abundance. Is it there or not? So if you impinge the silk, you still can stick, but you're not going to get 100% return. So if you look at 1965 to 1970, it's all red. That means there's no it's almost all red. You get a little bit of coccolithophores in here. The green is a track where you had coccolithophores present. And as you march through the decades and get out here to 2000 to 2010, you see a big increase. And you can see that here, that you kind of bump along, you get some spikes, but in the last decade or so, you get a pretty substantial increase in coccolithophore presence. So then the question is why? What's driving this? So that's the basic question that we set out looking at. So we have about 81,000 CPR records. They're both spatially and temporally irregular because they go where the ship goes, and shipping lanes change over time, shipping routes change over time. There's a lot of data, but it's not, if you were to design an experiment, you would not design it this way. You would design it very differently. We'll come back to a designed sampling approach in a little bit. And there's also lots of potential influencing factors. We've got temperature, nutrients, possibly competing and predatory species. It surprised me when we started talking with Anand and Sarah, people aren't 100% sure even what eats these things. I thought, okay, well, surely we at least know that. But we've also got then CO2, light, and some climate modes may play a role in there, particularly AMO, and we also looked at NAO and AO and some other things like that. Okay, so we've got data that's irregular in space and time. We anticipate that we're going to have some probably nonlinear relationships in the data, that is between things like temperature and CO2 and coccolithophore presence. And we're concerned with predictive accuracy, but we really want to use a validated predictive model to draw some insights into what the relationships are. So that's where we're really trying to go. It's not like we're trying to predict coccolithophore abundance in 2017 so we can do something. No, we want to understand what those drivers are. So we use what's called a random forest. So we'll introduce one type of model here. This is a fairly popular statistical learning theory method. It's an ensemble approach. And it's an ensemble, it's called a regression tree. So if you haven't seen a regression tree before, what it is a binary recursive partitioning of the data. So you take your data set, you drop it into the top node, and this is just on one tree. It splits on one variable, say sea surface temperature, at a given value, say 24 degrees C. Everything below 24 goes one way, everything above goes the other. And then you recursively partition this down, and there's an algorithm that goes through and figures out what the best partitions should be. With a random forest, we grow a whole bunch of those, hundreds of them perhaps. And then the prediction is the average across all of those. But when you grow them, you bootstrap the data, and so you're getting samples that aren't the same for every tree, and you're changing the variables you're allowed to use in here through some additional random sampling. So you get basically an ensemble of approximately uncorrelated predictive trees, and then the prediction is the average across all of those. It's an approach that's been shown to work pretty well and to be reasonably robust. It doesn't always work well, but we tried lots of different models, and this one in holdout testing was the best one that we could find for this data set. Okay, so what do you get out of something like this? One thing you get is a ranking of variable importance, and this is how important the variable is to the predictive accuracy of the model. That is, if we drop global CO2 from our global random forest model, global because we're using the global measure of CO2, that gives us the biggest decrease in predictive accuracy. So you take it out and you look at how much does predictive accuracy change if you take that variable out. And you do that with all of your variables. So we've got CO2, longitude, diatoms, flagellates, latitude, pressure, and you can just keep going down the list. We looked at different ways of measuring CO2. Probably these two are the most interesting. This one's the global, this one is the local model. So we've got a local measure of CO2. We can talk more about the details of that later if you're interested. But in both of these models, CO2 was the single most important variable in terms of predictive accuracy. If you look at this one, AMO shows up here as number 2, which is an interesting question because if we go back to this graph, you can see CO2 is going up, but AMO hits its positive phase here, which is the same time when we get the spike in coccolithophore abundance. So it's a little hard to untangle AMO and CO2, potentially. But we also have the spike in AMO here. We didn't, because AMO is a fairly long cycle, so we don't have multiple cycles, which we'd really like. We'll just have to do this project in another 50 years. But we have some other spikes in there too. So even given that, both of these models suggest that CO2 is the dominant factor in terms of predictive accuracy. We also can get basically an impact of the marginal influence of that variable on our probability of catching a coccolithophore. So as CO2 goes up, you can see we kind of have this plateau, and then it goes up quite a bit. That is, as CO2 gets higher, then we get this increase in coccolithophore probability of being there. Even with a local measure, we see an increase. And with AMO, you can see we also do tend to get an increase at the higher phase aspects of AMO, but it depends on which model and how we measured CO2 in there. So this is why we moved from just the global to getting a more local measure of CO2. So the model suggests that CO2 is important, which is interesting because you also have the acidification effect going on in there. So we then said, okay, we see this. This is interesting. It's not necessarily what we expected entirely. So then we went back and we, meaning Sarah, the student, looked through the literature and pulled out all the lab studies she could find of coccolithophore growth rates, basically. and looked at them as basically a function of CO2 and temperature and nutrients and all sorts of other things to try and get a sense of where within these lab studies are the conditions we're seeing in the field. So we can see our study is about in here for CO2. A lot of the lab studies were pushing CO2 pretty high. That is, they're looking at further out years, essentially, at projected CO2. So we were in this range, and it does suggest that, especially at the lower range, there is an increase in growth rates as you push CO2 up. Our CO2, the highest ones were here at the end. So it does offer some support that CO2, even when you account for things like nutrients and pH and things like that, that you do get a higher growth rate. So it does seem like CO2 is a major driver of increase in the coccolithophore abundance. There's this interesting indication that AMO may be telling us something. We're not sure what something is yet, which is one of the challenges you have when you start using these climate modes. Some hypothesis is nutrient turnover, maybe. I don't know. That one, I think, is a topic of discussion. And we get some agreement with the lab-based studies, but based on this multi-decadal record of abundance. OK, so when we think about implications of this, coccolithophores do seem to be able to adapt to a higher CO2 environment than at least some previously thought. And because coccolithophores are able to compete, and because they have a potential role in carbon cycling, it's something we need to be aware of. And we should probably expect changes in the plankton community, potentially with substantial impacts over the long run. OK, so now we're going to leave coccolithophores and switch to salinity and Vibrios in the Chesapeake. So this part of the talk is based on 3 papers, one in remote sensing the environment, one in environmental informatics, and one in PLOS1. So let's talk a little bit about Vibrios first. Vibrios are gram-negative bacteria, and some of them are pathogenic, including the organism that causes cholera, which has been detected in the Chesapeake Bay. We're going to focus more on, I'm going to call it for shorthand, para, and vulnificus, which are also pathogenic, and also in the Chesapeake Bay. The infections can be fatal, and have been a number of deaths. They are present in the Chesapeake Bay, and the human Vibrio cases have approximately doubled in the last decade. And there's pretty regular beach closures for not just Vibrios, but other stuff too. Their occurrence and abundance is highly dependent on water temperature and salinity. If you know water temperature and salinity, you have a pretty good idea what the growth rate of these things is. OK, so this was a different student who set off in that same course to do a term project to try and predict, are there Vibrios there or not? Basically, what's the probability of having a Vibrio at any given point in the bay? So if I'm up here at Elk Neck State Park, do I have to close my beach today? If I'm down here, do I have to close my beach today? Short of doing a water sample, or maybe even prioritizing where do we sample. The problem is that we don't have a lot of salinity measurements. So this is the sampling network, which looks pretty dense, but when you think about it, there's, I think, 67 sampling points at which they're pretty regularly sampling lots of things about the bay, oxygen levels, salinity, temperature, these sorts of things. So the first thing we said was, OK, can we try and fill in the gaps? That's kind of the first question. Can we fill in the gaps in salinity using some other approach? If we can do that, then we can try and predict Vibrios, maybe. OK, so the first step was say, can we estimate local salinity from remote sensed data? We were collaborating with Ben Zychek, which was Aaron Urquhart's advisor. Aaron was a student on this. Ben does a lot of remote sensing work. So they said, we want to try and estimate local salinity from remote sensed ocean color from MODIS. OK, I personally at the time didn't know very much about MODIS, but fine, we learn. So we trained the models using the Chesapeake Bay station data, and then predict for the other areas. And then we compare based on holdout testing. So we take a certain fraction of those stations out, train to the rest, predict the missing stations. We do this over and over again. We tried lots of different models. So generalized linear model, so it's a parametric regression model. Think linear model, but an account for very different sorts of conditional distributions. A generalized additive model, where you're fitting splines and then doing regression with that. The classification regression tree, that little tree that was embedded in the random forest, one of those. A different way of combining those, a random forest. Another tree-based method that combines those trees in a different way, a neural net. And this one is a multivariate adaptive regression spline. It's a different version of a regression model that uses a different sort of basis function. OK, so what did we use for variables? Well, our predictor variable, our response variable is salinity. This is what we're trying to estimate. We want to estimate salinity locally. To do that, we have lat and long. And this is important in the Chesapeake Bay because you got a lot of fresh water flowing into the top, pushing through the bay. So you've got the Susquehanna River coming in, delivering a large amount of fresh water. If you don't have lat and long in there, you're probably going to be in trouble. And then we've got reflectances at a bunch of different wavelengths. And with that, we want to try and estimate salinity and see if it'll work. Okay, so we try all the models. We do our random holdout testing. We did 120 random holdout samples here. And we can look at the mean squared error of these methods. So we put the mean model in there. So you have a basis of comparison. That is, pretend you don't have a model at all. So you always want to have some sort of basis of comparison. You better be able to do better than that, or your model is pretty worthless. Okay, so they all do better. Good. The best model here was the GAM model with an MSE of 5.67. We do the formal hypothesis test to compare it. It does better than almost all the other models in a statistically significant sense. And we can look at actual salinity versus predicted salinity from that model. And it looks reasonably well, though we have some points down there. So it gives us some confidence that it works okay. We also tried a neural net model is the second best model. I'm personally not a big fan of neural nets, but sometimes they work well. Okay, so what can we do with this? Why are we doing this? The reason we're doing this is we're trying to get localized estimates of salinity. So we went back to 9/18/2006 and said, can we estimate what salinity would have been on that day? Pretend we don't know the station data. So this was a date not used to train our model. Pretend we don't know these dots, those are the actual station data. We have to take all the areas where there's clouds, because we're still constrained by clouds. And then we predict the salinity everywhere else where we have the satellite signal, and we can compare to what goes on in these stations. So the root mean squared error there was 1.22. If we go back, the root mean squared error in the holdout was 2.38. So we actually do better on this particular day than we did in our random holdout test. And the spatial pattern of salinity is roughly what you would expect. That is, the lower bay is more saline. You've got the Susquehanna River coming in up here, so you've got basically fresh water up there. And it would have been nice if we didn't have clouds in there, so you could see that. But it's roughly what you would expect for a salinity map in the bay on a given day, in that time of year anyway. Okay, so now we can estimate salinity where we don't have measurements. And now we can think about estimating Vibrio. So we didn't have particularly good data on Vibrio presence. So Erin went out and did a few cruises, collected 148 surface water samples, not fully designed, and that she got on a ship that was going out for other reasons. So you can see we did some transects, but there's also just some other stuff in there. And it's only the top half of the bay. Would have been really nice to get that. But we didn't pay for the ship, so I can't complain. So we got lat, long, month, temp, and salinity. And we looked at this in two ways. The first is Vibrio there or not? So it's a classification model. The second is, okay, can we get a concentration, which is going to be a lot trickier? We tried both. So just to give you a sense of what the data looks like, we're going to look at vulnificus and para. Para's a little bit higher. You can see we've got a lot of high outliers. The mean for vulnificus is down here below 5. The mean of para is a bit above 5. And you can also see the sorts of conditions in which we sampled. So temperature, she was out there some chilly days all the way up to some pretty hot days. And then salinity we spanned all the way from 0 up to about 14. And you can see that there's some gaps in there. And this gap caused us some problems because we would really like to know what's going on in that gap, temperature-wise. Okay, so for occurrence models, we looked at two logistic models, a GLM and a GAM, and a random forest. And we did 100 repeated 20% random holdout samples. When we look at just the model fit, they're slightly different for the two species in some interesting ways. So vulnificus, you have temperature, salinity, and the interaction term. But when you look at para, you've got temperature and salinity and not the interaction term. So it's suggesting something potentially interesting. And this is looking across, because we really only have those two variables, temperature and salinity, to predict with here, plus the intercept. So it's suggesting that this one is more, that interaction is important for one species but not the other. Okay, so how well do the models do? Well, remember, we're trying to predict presence or absence. So we're estimating a probability. So when we look at, we can then segment our data into was that species actually there? And this one's vulnificus. Was it there or not? So there or not. And then we look at what the predicted probabilities were. You'd like to see separation in these two charts here. So this one is the predicted probability by the logistic GLM if it's not actually there. And that's the predicted probability if it is there. So that model doesn't help us distinguish those two cases. It's not a very good predictive model. The GAM starts to give us some ability to discern them. We'd like these bars to be smaller, but given our limited data of 148 samples, it gives us something to work with. And random forest also doesn't do very well in this one. So the GAM was the model that was doing the best for vulnificus, and we see something similar with para. We start to get a little more separation here, but it's still not great. A little more separation. Here we get some reasonable separation. We would really like this bar to be lower. But we'll come back to that. We only have 148 samples. There is another data set that we can't get access to. OK, then we looked at the abundance model. That is, can we predict, are they there? That's the occurrence model. What's the concentration if they are? Is it 1 cell per 10 milliliters? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 50? So we use a two-stage framework that I developed in a very different setting for predicting power outages, where you first predict the presence or absence, and then you make a conditional prediction on the concentration given the classification of presence or absence. And we again tested this with the repeated holdout sampling, so we're getting at predictive accuracy, not fit. OK, what do we get? So this is mean absolute error. So you take the difference, you take the absolute value of that, you sum it up, you take the mean. And we've got the GLM, the GAM, the random forest, a simple ensemble of those three, and then a mean-only model. So we should be able to do better than the mean-only model. Then we bend it by the actual count. So this is 1, 2 to 4, 5 to 10, and greater than 10. So when we look at vulnificus, the prediction errors are the smallest for the lowest concentrations, and they're kind of big for the higher concentrations. When we look over here, we see something similar, but once you get into the better models like the random forest, you can see it's better in this kind of 2 to 10 range, and on the ends it's not so good, and we see a similar pattern there. So these models tell us something. They're not great though, right? We would really like to get more accurate predictions than we were getting out of this, especially when you start comparing this to the mean. It's not that different necessarily. There's some data limitations. So this is a common theme when you start talking about data-driven modeling, that there's data limitations. But let's see what we can do with these models. There's one other model using a different data set developed by NOAA. So they have their own set of samples from the Chesapeake Bay of Vibrios, and they won't let us use the data. They developed a GLM based on that data, strict logistic GLM. And what you can do is you can plot, this is salinity and temperature, and what you're looking at here is the probability of vulnificus being there as a function of salinity and temperature. So this is a projection of a three-dimensional response surface. OK, so their model, the NOAA GLM, basically says, OK, we've got this kind of shape. It's a similar shape here from our GLM, except ours is steeper, and they get to the red zone much faster. Qualitatively, they're similar, but it's substantially different. Then we look at our GAM, and it's an entirely different sort of suggestion of what's going on. So here you'd say, OK, if I got a salinity of 5 and a temperature of 20, I'm pretty unlikely to have Vibrios there. With our GLM, if I'm 5 and 20, I'm moderately likely, 40%. With our GLM, if I'm 5 and 20, I'm up here at, similarly, say 40-ish%. We also then looked, well, what if conditions changed? So Aaron went and looked and said, OK, well, we've got one consensus climate scenario for the Bay that says things probably will shift from kind of this historic line up here to temperature salinity relationships. This one suggests you'd probably, on average, have more Vibrios. This one suggests probably more Vibrios. This one suggests less. So you get a qualitatively different conclusion out of the model that gives you the best out-of-sample predictive accuracy. And one interpretation of this is that this model suggests that we're already a bit past kind of the optimal growing temperature for Vibrios. So this one is our GAM. These two are both the GLM. That is, higher temperature, more likely to be there. That is, higher temperature is always good. Our GAM suggests, no, at some point it starts to go back down. And this is where it would have been really nice to have data in that temperature gap, just below 25. Because that's where a lot of interesting things happen, and that ship didn't stop in the right places for that one. We can also look at what would these models suggest in terms of probability of, and it's vulnificus again, probability of vulnificus being there by month. When we look at kind of average salinity, this is upper bay, mid bay, lower bay. This is temperature. These two are our models. The light blue is the GAM, dark blue is the GLM, and this is the NOAA model. So our models always suggest a higher probability of Vibrios being there. Again, they're based on different data sets. We would have loved to have their data because then we could have made a much better comparison, but they would not share it. Erin tried to get their data set first and then basically went onto the ship because they wouldn't share their data set with her. We can then go back and we can hindcast. So we hindcast 2012 by month for each of the 3 models. So this is the Chesapeake Bay, a little miniature Chesapeake Bay, and the color is the probability of having Vibrios there. So we start with April. NOAA model says basically they're not there. Our GLM says some chance they're there, and our GAM says nope, they're probably not there. And then you can trace it through over time, and you can see in almost all cases our models are suggesting higher chance of Vibrios being present. And you can see when you're here in August, and particularly here in September, there's a very high chance of having Vibrios present, which if you're concerned about water quality in bathing and shellfish consumption, that's good information to know. Because shellfish consumption is one of the ways in which there is human exposure to Vibrios. Okay, so from this kind of general insights, the model matters. And the model form matters. In our case, the model with the best out-of-sample predictive accuracy gave us different conclusions about the timing and magnitude of changes in Vibrio risk. We really need more data. It'd be really nice if somebody would go sample that lower half of the bay, and the upper half again, and give us a lot more data. But based on the data we've got, you'd see some different insights. We can seem to use the remote sense data to get some reasonably good estimates of salinity locally, even where we don't have a sampling station. But we really need more Vibrio data. We'd like to fill in that gap just below 25 C, and we'd like to get some at higher salinity levels from the lower bay. Okay, now I'm going to switch completely to power systems. Still sticking with climate. But now we're going to talk about the potential impacts of climate change on hurricane-induced hazards to coastal energy systems. Okay, so our research questions that we were trying to get at is how would potential changes in hurricane hazards, intensity, frequency, or landfall location, change the risk to coastal energy systems? That is, if hurricanes become more intense by a certain amount, how much more at risk is the coastal energy system, and is it uniform? Which areas are most sensitive to changes in hurricane hazards? And can we simulate these in a way that we can get some reasonable insights? We had been working on forecasting power outages from hurricanes for about 10 years at this point. We were working on about 8 years before we started this particular project, and it was very much working with a utility or the Department of Energy to develop a predictive model. We see a storm coming, you predict the impacts, they make decisions on how to respond to that storm. We started asking the question, particularly after Irene, really, well, is every place equally sensitive to changes in the hurricane environment? Because there's a lot of kind of political and general population arguments after Irene that, oh, the East Coast suddenly gets hurricanes. We have lots of hurricanes. We need to bury all the power lines, which costs about $1 million a line mile. So this would have been phenomenally expensive. Well, does every place really need to do that, or are there differences in sensitivities? Okay, so what we have is a coupled large-scale simulation of hurricane occurrence, track, and intensity, a hurricane wind field model that we then run for each storm, and then a model that predicts the impacts on the power system for each storm. So we basically simulate thousands of storms. For each run a wind field model to estimate the local wind field, and then look at the impacts on power systems. And this is an example of one simulated hurricane making landfall along the Texas-Louisiana area. And you can see we've got high outages here. So this is the fraction of customers without power at the census tract level for one storm. So now we can do this lots and lots of times. The basis for doing that is a power outage prediction model. So this is the one we developed for utility companies and for the Department of Energy. We've got 2 models. One is utility specific. I'm not going to be talking about that one today. That one gives predictions for a particular power company. We have one that we can run anywhere along the US coastline and uses only publicly available data. So with the utility one, we know where the poles are, we know where the lines are, we know a lot of stuff about the power system. With a spatially generalized one, we don't. So the data that goes into this are things like our hurricane wind speed model. It's a parametric wind field model that basically is a spinning vortex model that we've validated in the central Gulf Coast region. In some of the models, we have things like soil type, topography, soil moisture levels right before the storm, these sorts of things, not when we're doing long-term projections. And then with the utility specific, we have things about the power system. To give you a sense of what these predictions look like, this is from the utility specific model, but this is Hurricane Ivan, the actual outage map. I can't show a better map because the utility wishes to remain anonymous, yet they let me show this. This is grid cells that are 12,000 feet by 8,000 feet, and it's the number of outages in each grid cell. So you can kind of see where the big metro areas are. This is predicted using best track. So we go back after the storm, we use best track, so we eliminate the forecast uncertainty and just look at, well, what would the model do if we had the actual or the best estimate of the track we could get? And we showed this to the utility company, and they said, okay, it's good enough. We're not going to spend more money on you developing better predictive models. So now we're doing other things for them. Okay, so we take a version of that model, and the first thing we did is said, can we simulate under the past hurricane environment? That is, we look back at the past 150 or so years of hurricanes, then you can look at the spatial distribution of landfall location. So we've got the 50-kilometer coastal bands. We know how many storms made landfall in each one. We've got the historical distribution of intensity, better for the latter half of that period. And we also have the frequency, so we know how many storms there were in each year. Once we know that, then we can simulate how many storms make landfall in each year from the historic distribution. It's actually pretty well modeled with a Poisson distribution with a mean of 2. We can simulate from the historic landfall location distribution. That is basically a spatial probability distribution all along the coast. And then we can simulate from the historic intensity. And we can do this over and over and over and over and over again until we get enough replications to get convergence in those upper quantiles of the distribution. And we can then start to ask some interesting questions. Because really what we've had in the US is one realization of a stochastic process of hurricanes. So we just created a lot more. The first thing we did was we simulated, in this case it took us about 1,600 simulated years worth of storms under past climate conditions on average to get good convergence at our upper quantile that we're looking at. First thing we simulated was the 100-year wind speed. That is the wind speed that you would expect to exceed with an annual exceedance probability of 0.01. The reason we did this is that civil engineers use this for a design standard and have estimated it in other ways. So you can go to the ASCE 7 design standards for structures where they've estimated this locally using local wind records to some extent with extreme value statistics methods. So if what we do matches what they did, that gives us some confidence we're at least getting the wind environment the same that they got, doesn't mean it's right, under historic climate conditions. So then we can go in, we can spot check all over here, and it actually does surprisingly well. I thought we'd be off by more. But for example, I think in Miami we're off by 2 meters per second or something like that. Off by a little bit more in Raleigh. So we have some confidence that our wind environment's probably similar at least to different ways of estimating it. Once we have that, then we can start to look at the results from simulating the power outages. So from every one of those storms, we simulated the number of power outages. This is a graph of the probability of at least 10% of customers being without power in a given year at the census tract level. So we're doing these estimates for all 37,000 census tracts, I think it's 37,000, in the potentially impacted area. So they're very localized estimates. And you can see what you'd expect. Gulf Coast, Florida, and this part of the Carolinas is where you have your risk of moderate power outages. But then we can look at something like this, which is the 100-year fraction of customers without power at the census tract level. So not the easiest thing to explain, particularly when the media asks you. But at the census tract level, what's the fraction of customers without power that you would expect to exceed on average once every 100 years? And then we look at that at all census tracts. And we have some small denominator problems where you don't have many people, you get a few people out, you get a pretty big number. Ignore that part of Maine. So you can see along the coast is kind of what you'd expect, that your 100-year storm, in a sense, is pretty bad. That basically everybody's without power or awfully close to it. This is under historic climate state. Then we can start to look at changing certain things. Rather than try and put a probability distribution on the number of storms in the future over time, the intensity, and the landfall location, we said we're going to look at the climate literature. We're going to see what hurricane modelers are suggesting might happen. And you look enough and you can see, okay, you can kind of bound the estimates that intensity might go down by 20%, not too many people saying that still, but there's still some out there, up to maybe an increase of 40%. At the point we looked at this a couple years ago, kind of the upper bound on average increase in the storm intensity was about 40%. So we said, okay, well, we'll run some scenarios. We got our baseline. One scenario is about 20% less intense, 20% more intense, and 40% more intense. And then these graphs are changes relative to the baseline. And the top one is 100-year wind speed. So if it's red, you've got an increase. So if storms get on average 40% more intense, you get more intense 100-year wind speeds. So it's not surprising. But what's interesting is kind of where. Up here in New York, New Jersey area, you've got this little pocket where you get substantially more increase. That'll come back again. We can also look at the 100-year fraction of customers without power. And these were interesting. The first time I saw these from the student, I said, what's that? I said, go run your code again. She ran her code. It's still there. I said, check your code. She checked her code. We ran it again. And running it is not a trivial task. It was a few days on our cluster. Okay, we said, okay, so we don't see anything wrong with code. We keep getting it. We did more replications. We keep getting it. What's going on? Our hypothesis is that as you get more intense storms, so 40% more intense, they push further inland before they die out. So you're getting areas that are getting impacts that never really had impacts before. This is a change. And if the baseline is essentially 0, and you start to get some outages, then you have this red band appearing. Whereas in here, they were getting some outages before, so their baseline is higher. And along the coast, you do get some intensification, particularly once you start looking up in this area here, because if storms are getting more intense, they're going to push further north before they die out, and you're probably going to get some stronger storms making landfall. Again, ignore Maine. Then we looked at changes in frequency. So the baseline is, on average, about 2 storms make landfall in the US per year, so that's this. If we were lucky and got down to 1, not surprisingly, you'd change your power outage risk, and this is, again, probability of at least 10% of customers without power in a given year. If you had just 1 more storm per year, it changes quite a bit. So now we've pushed this 10% all the way up into Virginia, and the bottom part of the Delmarva Peninsula, and parts of Florida have gotten darker yellow. That is, they have a pretty substantial risk of power outages in a given year. If you double the number of storms, which is an extreme case, Florida gets pretty bad. We can then start comparing metro areas. So this is what we're really most interested in some ways, is are all metro areas equal in their sensitivity to potential changes in hurricane hazard? So this is Washington, D.C., and this is New York City. And this is looking just at intensity. So baseline is here, and then we change the intensity, and not much happens to Washington, D.C. You change the intensity in New York, and you get a really big response. Washington, D.C. is a bit inland. It's protected by the Delmarva Peninsula. It takes a pretty special hurricane to really hammer Washington, D.C. New York sits right on the coast. Historically hasn't had a lot of storms because it's kind of north. But if your storms are becoming 40% more intense, they're probably going to be pushing further north before they die out. So New York seems pretty sensitive. We then did this for all 27 major metro areas and rank ordered them by change in outages. So New York is first. They're the most sensitive. That is, they would see the biggest increase in outage risk. It doesn't mean they have the biggest outage risk. They see the biggest increase. If you would look down the list here, there's Miami, so they're probably one of the bigger outage risks. But their baseline is high, so they appear lower down the list because they get a little worse, but they started so high they don't have that much room to get worse. So we've got New York followed by Philadelphia, and then Jacksonville. So Jacksonville's on that bite of Florida and doesn't actually get very many hurricanes. So we did this when I was at Hopkins. They have a very active media office, and they convinced me to do a media release on this. And then we started getting lots of calls from Philadelphia and Hartford, Connecticut saying, what? We don't get hurricanes. Exactly. Their baseline is low. So your baseline's low. We're looking at change. You're in an area that if storms became more intense, they could push in and get you, basically, is what we're seeing with New York and Philadelphia. And then we had to explain 100-year fraction of customers without power at a census tract level to reporters, which I don't know. I had no experience doing that when I was in grad school. Okay, so some insights from this. Not all areas of the country are created equal in their sensitivity to climate-induced changes in hurricane hazards. Despite some of the political discourse that says all utilities should start installing, all coastal utilities should start installing concrete poles and burying lines. Well, that's awfully expensive, and not all places are equally sensitive to these changes. And even without probabilistic climate model-based projections of hurricane hazards, we can start to gain some understanding. We can't make the probabilistic projections of impacts that we might want without doing that, but we can start to get some understanding of which areas are most sensitive and which aren't. And at the core of this is that validated predictive model of storm impacts. Okay, so a few concluding thoughts. Looking across all these projects and others, data-driven predictive modeling and simulation can be useful tools to start looking at climate variability and climate change and the impacts of these things, but you've got to be really rigorous about validation. That is, you've got to do lots of validation testing to make sure you're actually getting good predictive models. Fit is not equal to prediction. If you remember nothing else from my talk, remember that. And you have to be flexible in the models you use and compare many different models. There's sometimes a challenge that some modelers face that they have their favorite model, and that's their go-to model, and that's what I always use. Well, you need to check. You need to check lots of different models because in some cases, something else might be a better predictive model for that particular setting. We've developed our own model, so I'd like to say that's my favorite model and always works well. It doesn't. Sometimes an off-the-shelf model is exactly what I need. So you also don't want to always jump in and say, I need a brand new complex statistical model to do this, because sometimes you need something that exists already. You also have to be creative about the data sources and cautious about really understanding what that data is and what its limitations are and how good is that data. And on all of these projects, I've always worked with someone who knows the domain well. So a climatologist often, microbiologists, and they're usually in the lead. So there are some limitations. So the research team really does have to understand the physical system. You can't just take a data set and throw it at a statistician and say, give me some insights. You've got to understand what variables should I be looking at? What kind of relationship should I expect to see? What are the limitations in MODIS-derived data, for example? And past data this is a fundamental assumption of almost all statistical modeling, that the past data has to be relevant to future conditions. There's a lot of concern about stationarity. But what we're really asking is, are the relationships stationary? That's different than asking if the response variable is stationary. So we have another whole set of research that's looking at flood risk. Probably not stationary in many places. But are the relationships stationary? If I'm going to use a statistical model, I'm really concerned about those relationships. And that's a hard question to answer sometimes. And don't make the modeling more complicated than it really needs to be. Like I said, sometimes what you need is an off-the-shelf model. Sometimes what you need is a homegrown, great new statistical model. And again, don't confuse good fit with good predictive accuracy. I'm going to stop there, take questions.
When you take a flight and you think about a plane that goes from Detroit to Los Angeles, that's what you care about. Pilot goes from Detroit to Los Angeles, your bag goes from Detroit to Los Angeles. But that plane potentially started the day in Atlanta.